Chapter 6 The ESP Message. "Oh," the wax queen said, her face flushing in embarrassment. "You stare at me as if I were not of this earth. I assure you I'm just a mortal, even though I do have ESP. "ESP?" said Louise. "You mean extrasensory perception?" The woman nodded. "Yes, often I know what other people are thinking. That's mental telepathy, of course. And sometimes I have precognition, the ability to see the future." "Can you do these things anytime you want to?" Louise asked. "No, but it's easier for me to receive knowledge if I go into deep concentration. I can't explain exactly what happens." She went on with a little frown. "But I will get a feeling that something is coming on me. A mental image or voices, even just an impression. For the want of a better word, I call it a message." "Has anyone ever explained how ESP works?" Jean asked. The Queen smiled. "Not really. Some scientists are investigating the subject, though." Suddenly she said, "The psychic power I have must show in my face, for you looked amazed when you saw me." Jean spoke up quickly. "We didn't mean to be rude. The reason we were staring is that we recognized you from the Penfield Carnival. You tried to stop Mr. Denver from letting a girl draw the lucky number out of the barrel." It was the Wax Queen's turn to stare. "Penfield, you say? I was never in Penfield in my life." "But," Jean began. The Queen interrupted. "The woman you saw must have been my twin sister. We look very much alike." As the sculptress paused and gazed into space, the girls thought of the note they had received. Jean was about to ask if the Queen's sister was Winifred Moffat when the woman said, almost as if talking to herself, "So, she's after him too." The Danas and their cousin exchanged puzzled glances. Louise ventured to ask what the Queen meant. "The episode you saw in Penfield has a direct bearing on the mystery I'd like you to solve." The girls waited expectantly for her to go on. As she seemed about to speak again, Ozma appeared and said, "Dear Queen, I must go home soon. Do you wish me to show these young ladies the wax room before I leave?" "Oh, yes." The Queen motioned to her guests. "Will you all go with Ozma, please? You may leave your coats in the closet here." She pointed to a heavy, old-fashioned door. "I feel another message coming to me, which may help settle one of the problems. I must concentrate now." After the visitors had hung up their coats, Ozma ushered them through the door at the rear into a good-sized, windowless room with a large skylight. Against the long rear wall was a stainless steel counter with several big shiny containers at one end. "Those are the melting pots," Ozma said. "There's an electrical heating unit in the counter under them." Then he nodded towards a corner. "Over there in the floor is the warm wax pit where we keep large quantities of liquid wax. Be careful." He cautioned quickly as the girls followed him. "The floor is slippery." Layers of spilled and hardened wax had made the rough concrete floor treacherous. Jean peered into one of the open pots. Smells nice." "Beeswax, the finest there is," said Ozma. He pointed to wall shelves stacked with blocks of white wax. "It comes like that. I melt the wax and let it stand until the consistency is just right for the Queen to handle." "How smooth and white it is," said Louise. "Not in the hive," Ozma declared. "There it's brown, but before the wax is sold, it is bleached in the sun and rain until it's milk white. Of course, there are all kinds of waxes and many uses for them." He pointed to Jean's purse. "You polished that with wax, I'll bet." Mrs. Carson glanced at a basket on the counter. It was filled with wax heads and hands. Ozma flicked them with his finger. "Discards, all to be melted down." "They look so real," Louise observed with a shiver. "How does she achieve such lifelike skin tones?" Ozma smiled wisely. "Only the Queen knows that. Waxworking is an old art, and the mixtures of waxes and pigments have always been a secret. In Italy, they were handed down from father to son." He next pointed to a row of bottles on a shelf above the counter. "There are the colors she uses for painting the faces and clothes." He picked up one. "Gold dust," he whispered. "Sometimes she sprinkles it in the wax to make it shimmer." Suddenly the old man's eyes gleamed. "Would you like to see ugly Emma?" He whisked open a drawer and lifted out the wax head of a girl with a blurred-looking face and real hair covering only one side of her head. "Each hair is inserted separately with a hot needle," Asma explained. "But this poor girl was left in the sun and she melted. That's why she hasn't been finished." He patted the head affectionately and put it away. "What about wax dolls?" Jean asked. "Our grandmother had one." "Oh, yes," Asma said. "The Italian ones were especially beautiful, but many a little girl cried over a melted face. Unfortunately, the dolls couldn't be played with in summer. Instead, they were well wrapped, put in airtight boxes, and stored in a cool place. Now, look here." Asma darted across the floor to a panel of photographs on the wall near the wax pit. As the girls and their cousin hurried after him, Jean slipped. With a cry, she skidded towards the well of liquid wax. Louise seized her sister's arm, but too late. Jean fell, pulling Louise with her. Mrs. Carson screamed as the two landed at the edge of the pit. Jean's arms flew out and her hands and purse splashed into the deep well of warm liquid. For a moment, both girls and their cousin were breathless with shock. Then Mrs. Carson started towards them. "Stay there," Louise warned, as she and Jean sat up. "The floor slants a little here, and it's slick as ice." Carefully they stood up and walked gingerly to their cousin, who held out her hands to them. "Thank you, Louise," Jean said with a shaky laugh. "You saved me from a wax bath." Osmo had not moved. "That would have been too bad," he said with a chuckle. The visitors wondered at the man's odd sense of humor. Chuckling again, he pointed to her dripping purse, rapidly turning white as the wax cooled. "You won't have to put any more on that." Jean grimaced. "No, I'll be peeling it off." As the wax grew firmer, Jean removed it from her hands and bag. Meanwhile, Osmo led them to the panel of photographs he had started to show them before. "These are wax funeral effigies," he announced cheerfully. "When a Roman nobleman died, a wax figure of him was carried in his funeral procession. The custom lasted many centuries. See?" He pointed to several full-length figures in costume. Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Anne, Lord Nelson, all these figures are in Westminster Abbey. "They look so natural," Jean remarked. Osmo opened his eyes wide. "Oh, it's amazing what can be done with wax." He pointed to the two doors at the left end of the room. "One of those rooms," he said, "is where the Queen makes her lifelike statues. In secret. Usually she keeps both doors locked and rarely lets anyone into her studio." "Why does she work in seclusion?" Jean asked. Osmo hunched his stooped shoulders. "I think it's because her ESP tells her what to do." Louise smiled. "Judging from the statues we saw outside, she must get very good advice." The girls became serious again, wondering if there was some other reason why the wax queen locked Osmo outside of her studio. Didn't she trust him? "What's behind the other door?" asked Jean. Osmo explained that the old and valuable wax pieces were kept in the room. Rarely did the sculptress show them. "Is Queen Victoria in there?" Jean asked. "Yes," Osmo answered. A frightened look crept over his face. "One morning I opened the front door, and there she sat, as big as life on a shelf. Nobody knows how she got here or why." His lips shut tight as he turned abruptly and led them back into the anteroom. The wax queen sat on a couch. She looked extremely worried. "I received a message. It was an answer to how Queen Victoria got here. She was stolen." "Stolen?" Mrs. Carson exclaimed. "By whom and from whom?" The sculptress said that unfortunately the message had not provided any names. "What I'm particularly worried about," she said, "is that I'm harboring stolen goods." "Shouldn't you call the police?" Cousin Cynthia asked quickly. "Not yet," the Queen replied. "Under the circumstances, I think I'd better call my lawyer for advice." Suddenly the sculptress spoke with spirit. "I don't want my name brought before the public in this connection. It could ruin my business." "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Mrs. Carson. "I know how upsetting it must be. The girls and I will leave now and come back tomorrow." There was a long pause. The wax queen looked up at her visitors. No, I do not want you to go yet. For a moment I lost my head, but I'm all right now. I must show you Queen Victoria. The sculptress arose and led the way to her private display room. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and turned on an elegant, old-fashioned ceiling lamp. The visitors hardly noticed the shelves of fine statues in white, amber, and black. The girls stood in the doorway, amazed at what they saw. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, stood the bust of Queen Victoria. The wax figure was exquisite in texture and so finely delineated that the monarch looked as if she were about to speak. There was the hint of a smile on the stately face, and the hair was combed gracefully around her temples. She wore a crown studded with jewels of various colors, which glittered and sparkled in the strong beam of light overhead. "It's gorgeous!" Jean cried out, and Louise added, "It's the most beautiful statue I've ever seen." "And the most finely molded I have ever seen," the wax queen told them. "I believe this bust is almost priceless." "But why, oh, why did the thief leave it here?" "That may be a very difficult mystery to solve," Louise remarked. "Is it what you wanted us to work on?" The woman's eyes grew sad. "I have two mysteries for you. This is one of them." Jean had walked forward to examine the Latin inscription etched into the base of the statue. "Imperi Nostra Regina," she read. "That means, our Queen of the Empire." "I hope she was a happier queen than I am," said the sculptress. "I'm in deep trouble. You girls must try to help me." As the sculptress spoke, she seemed to become very tired and grew pale. Suddenly she put one hand to her head and began to sway. Fearful that she was about to faint, Louise and Jean assisted her to the couch in the anteroom. After a few minutes, the sculptress's color returned, and she smiled. "I'm all right now." The callers were relieved and said they must go. This time the wax queen made no objections. "I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow when I'll tell you about the other mystery." Mrs. Carson and the girls got their coats and took a taxi back to the apartment house, where they found the bookcase still in place. Cousin Cynthia looked at her watch. "It's just about time for the news," she said. "Louise, will you turn on the TV?" She and the girls sat down to listen to the newscast. Suddenly they all leaned forward, startled by what the announcer was saying. "The police have just revealed that a valuable wax bust of Queen Victoria has been stolen from the private collection of Mr. and Mrs. Philip Anderson." Louise and Jean were thunderstruck. The Queen's ESP message had been correct. Then a second thought came to Louise. Seeing the troubled expression on her sister's face, Jean asked what the matter was. "You realize," said Louise, "that what she told us about having ESP might be a hoax. The Queen herself could be the thief." End of chapter 6.